A $40,000 bounty on every cop, dead or alive. That's all, Martz said, voice cold as the steel beneath his hand. His sons were gone, killed by cops who claimed they feared for their lives. But Martz didn't fear anything. He ran the city's most dangerous crew, and revenge wasn't just a mission, it was a promise. By the time the sun set, the streets would be flooded with bounty hunters, killers, and mercenaries, all hunting one thing, the badge. What started as a father's grief would soon become the city's darkest war. And no one at all would be safe. The city was waking up, but it wasn't ready for what the day would bring. The sky was still a bruised purple as the sun crawled behind dark clouds, casting a dull light over cracked sidewalks and peeling storefronts. The streets seemed quiet, almost too quiet, but beneath the stillness, there was an undeniable hum. A restless, suffocating tension that gripped the air. In every shadowed corner, every rusting lamppost, there was a sense that something was about to snap. This wasn't just any neighborhood. It was his neighborhood, Martz's neighborhood. The gang leader didn't need to walk down the block to know that his iron grip was felt in every inch of this territory. His crew didn't just control corners. They ran the city's pulse. And today, that pulse was quickening. On the corner by the corner store, the loud hum of a broken neon sign flickered weakly, casting a sickly light across the few early risers who dared venture out before the heat of the day set in. A few young men loitered, leaning against walls and hoods of old cars, exchanging quiet words. The air smelled of sweat, gasoline, and burnt rubber from the last night's heat. They were waiting, just like everyone else, for the inevitable to happen. But for now, it was still calm. Jamal and Tyrell, two of the city's sons, but not just any sons. Sons of the Kingpin. Sons of Martz. They walked down the street with no hint of the storm that was coming. Their laughter echoed down the cracked pavement, a stark contrast to the quiet unease that surrounded them. They were just two kids, trying to make it through the day. No one would have guessed, just by looking at them, that they were connected to the Iron Set, the sons of a man who ruled the streets. They looked like any other teens, heads thrown back, laughing over some inside joke, walking in rhythm with each other, their energy alive and contagious. Tyrell, the older one, grinned and nudged Jamal in the ribs. "Man, you better bring your A game to that game on Saturday," he teased, his voice light. "If you lose to Marcus, I'm never hearing the end of it." Jamal rolled his eyes, his grin widening. "Please, Marcus can barely dribble. I'm about to school him so bad, he's going to be seeing stars." They had plans, big plans for the weekend. Tyrell's first real date with Jasmine, who he'd been texting nonstop for weeks, and Jamal's championship game. They were going to be on top of the world. There was no stopping them now. But as their laughter filled the air, they had no idea that it was the last time they would feel so carefree. They rounded the corner, and the neon sign of the corner store flickered above them like a faded dream. Jamal checked his phone, his fingers swiping through messages. Tyrell bumped his shoulder, glancing at the screen. "Still texting that girl? You sure you're ready for that?" "Shut up, man." "I'm good. I'm ready." "I'll keep it cool," Jamal chuckled, but the nervous energy in his voice didn't go unnoticed. "Just don't forget, she's got to meet the family soon," Tyrell reminded, his voice serious now. At the same moment, across the street, a police car cruised slowly by, its lights flashing faintly in the early morning haze. The officers inside barely spared a glance for the boys, but that brief glance, that tiny moment of recognition, sent a ripple through the air. Everything seemed fine at first. Too fine, but something was wrong. The atmosphere, heavy with the weight of unspoken tension, was like a kettle about to boil over. There were whispers of bad blood. The boys had heard the talk in the streets, in the shadows. The cops didn't trust Martz, and they didn't trust his kids. And with things heating up between rival gangs, it was only a matter of time before that bad blood came to a head. The officers in the patrol car exchanged a glance, a brief moment of uncertainty, but neither of them said a word. They had heard the rumors, the whispers of retaliation, and as they passed by, their eyes didn't miss a beat. Tyrell and Jamal were out of place on the street. Even if they didn't realize it, their father's enemies were everywhere. And when you grew up with that name, everyone knew who you were. As Jamal and Tyrell kept walking, their backs to the cops and the world around them, the tension started to mount. For a moment, everything was normal. But there was something in the air. Something that didn't belong. And then, in a flash, it exploded. Without warning, gunshots rang out. The first shot hit Tyrell in the chest. The second followed so quickly that Jamal barely had time to react. He felt a sharp pain in his side and stumbled, his vision blurred. The world around him became a spinning nightmare. The world seemed to slow down as his legs gave way beneath him. His brother was on the ground. Beside him, his body was still. The laughter that had once filled the air now felt like a distant memory. The pain in Jamal's chest deepened, his breathing coming in short, sharp gasps. His hand reached out instinctively for Tyrell, but his body didn't respond. A brief moment of confusion, of fear. The world shifted, and then everything went black. Screams rang out from the houses nearby. Doors flew open, and neighbors rushed to their windows, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief. A few brave souls dashed outside to see what happened, but the gunfire was enough to send most of them retreating back behind their doors. Jamal's vision came back slowly, but the world around him was a blur of movement. The flashing lights of squad cars, the red and blue reflecting off the faces of the fallen boys. And in the midst of it all, Martz's heart was already working its dark magic. The gang leader stood a few blocks away, watching the chaos unfold, feeling the rage and the coldness seep through him. His two sons, gone in the blink of an eye. He felt the fire rage inside him, but the fire of vengeance was just beginning. The officer who fired the shots hadn't meant to kill them, but the world doesn't care about intention. Martz knew that better than anyone. He knew the streets better than anyone. And now, as the sun began to rise, the city would know what happens when a father loses everything. The street was empty now. The stores, the streetlights, the faces, and the windows, they all seemed to disappear into a void. The hum of the city had stopped, replaced by the crackling sound of police radios. The sirens wailed. The bodies were still. The tension in the air thickened, but now it wasn't just in the shadows. It was everywhere. Martz walked slowly toward the scene, his face cold, his steps measured. This was his moment. It was his turn. Now, and everyone, from the cops to the families who lived here, would soon know what it meant to cross him. His sons were dead, but their legacy? That was just beginning. A crack of gunfire broke the morning calm. It wasn't a loud explosion. It wasn't even a single shot. It was two shots, quick and deliberate. The air was thick with tension, just seconds before. Then chaos. Jamal's body jerked, his knees buckling as he collapsed to the pavement. The sound of his body hitting the ground drowned out by the ringing in his ears. Tyrell fell beside him, just as swiftly, his legs giving out from under him. His face, twisted in pain, hit the cracked concrete with a sickening thud. The quiet of the street was shattered out for a moment. Everything stood still. Then came the panic. Officers scrambled, voices sharp with urgency. The confusion flooded the block like a tidal wave. People, still half asleep, burst from their homes, peering out windows, racing to their doors, their hands shaking as they tried to process what they had just witnessed. Get down. Get back inside. Someone screamed. Mothers ran to their children, pulling them inside, their arms wrapped tightly around their small bodies, trying to shield them from the world outside. Their cries filled the air, their terror blending with the wailing of sirens growing louder by the second. From across the street, the hum of phones turned into a roar. Neighbors' fingers were already swiping, recording everything, capturing the final moments of Jamal and Tyrell's lives. Each click of the phone's camera added another layer to the chaos. Everyone had their piece of the story, but no one could grasp the horror of it. The streets were suddenly alive with fear. The air, once thick with morning fog, now felt suffocating with the weight of what had just happened. The silence following the shots felt unbearable, broken only by the distant screech of sirens. A heavy silence enveloped the scene, thickening the atmosphere until the only sound was the slow, Relentless pounding of Jamal's and Tyrell's heartbeats, or what remained of them. A woman, standing in the doorway, shook her head slowly, unable to look away from the bodies that lay on the pavement. She clutched her daughter close to her chest, shielding her from the growing crowd of onlookers dot across the street. A man's voice trembled as he shouted to the officers, his hands waving in disbelief. "What the hell are you doing?" "They're kids. They didn't do anything." His words fell flat, swallowed by the escalating chaos. A second later, the screams of the neighbors were joined by the all-too-familiar sound of a loud crash as the squad cars screeched to a halt. More officers rushed from their vehicles, their heavy boots pounding on the pavement. But none of them were in control anymore. The street had turned into a battlefield, and they were ill-prepared for what was to come. The police officers hurried to the bodies of the two teens, radioing for backup. They moved with mechanical precision, but their eyes betrayed them. For a moment, they had been the ones to take control of the situation, but now they seemed helpless. The confusion rippled through them, just as it did the bystanders. The bleeding had already begun. Blood pooled underneath the boys' bodies, staining the cracked pavement beneath them, turning the street into a gruesome spectacle for the neighbors to witness. More officers arrived, their presence an explosion of chaos. Their radios crackled, with frantic orders, but none of it mattered. All that was left was the aftermath, the hollow feeling that lingered in the air. Martz stood at the edge of the street, just out of sight, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. His jaw was tight, and his eyes were fixed on the scene in front of him, but his expression remained unreadable. He could hear the chaos, the sirens, the shouting, the screaming, but it felt distant. Muted dot his two sons lay dead in the street. Jamal and Tyrell, his pride, his blood, and the world had taken them away from him in a heartbeat. He felt something in his chest, a familiar emptiness that he had grown used to over the years, a hollow void that threatened to swallow him whole. But beneath it, beneath that crushing sorrow, something else stirred. Cold, icy. He wasn't just mourning his sons. He was preparing for war. The sound of a door creaking open broke his focus. One of his lieutenants stepped up beside him, his face etched with concern. "Boss." The man's voice faltered, unsure if Martz had even heard him. Martz didn't respond. His eyes remained locked on the bodies, his face stone cold. He didn't need to speak for the lieutenant to know what he was thinking. They had crossed line, and now Martz had to do what he did best, take control. "Call the others," Martz muttered, his voice low but sharp. "The bounty's love. Make sure everyone knows." The lieutenant hesitated. "You sure about this, Martz?" "We're talking about cops." Martz's eyes turned cold, and for a brief moment, the air around them felt even colder. "They killed my sons," Martz said flatly, the finality in his words enough to silence the lieutenant. "No one safe now? You understand?" His gaze never left the street. His lieutenant nodded slowly, stepping away without another word. Martz's focus remained unbroken. His sons were gone, but their deaths would not be in vain. The city would burn. It had to. Martz would make sure of that. As the officers continued to circle the bodies, the media began to arrive. News vans pulled up in a rush, their flashing lights adding to the chaos. The reporter, microphone in hand, dashed towards the crime scene, her eyes wide as she took in the horrific sight. "Who's in charge here?" she asked an officer, breathless from her sprint. The officer didn't answer immediately, his gaze shifting between the bodies and the crowd of neighbors now gathered along the block. His face was a mask of confusion and frustration. "We're trying to contain the situation," he muttered, his voice betraying his growing panic. The officer's hand trembled as he adjusted his radio, clearly shaken by the turn of events. Meanwhile, Martz's phone buzzed in his pocket. He fished it out quickly, his fingers brushing the cracked screen before he read the message that had just arrived. $40,000 per badge, dead or alive. The words burned in his chest. This was the moment. The war for his sons had just begun, and he would be the one to lead it. As the news of the killing spread, the reactions were quick and varied. In homes across the city, people whispered in fear and disbelief. In the streets, the words revenge and bounty began to circulate. Within hours, Martz's name was on everyone's lips. The Iron Set, once a shadow, now loomed over the city like a dark cloud, threatening to swallow everyone in its path. The public debate began to fracture. Some saw Martz as a villain, a man driven by vengeance. Others, though, saw him as something else, a man wronged by the very system that was supposed to protect him. For every cop who had killed his sons, Martz would take their badge. The police were just as divided. Some were eager for retribution, others terrified of what was to come. The streets had been peaceful, and now, in the blink of an eye, they were. A war zone dot in the heart of the city. In a small apartment cluttered with outdated furniture, a man sitting at a worn-out desk typed out a message and hit send. $40,000 for every badge. The bounty was out. The streets were on fire, and no one was safe. Martz's steps were slow as he walked away from the bodies of his sons. His heart thundered in his chest, but it wasn't just grief that fueled him now. No, grief was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not yet, not now. The cold, sharp pain in his chest dug deeper with every step, but beneath that pain, there was something else, something far darker. The rage that coursed through him wasn't born of emotion. It was born of something far colder. Revenge. It was a feeling he had lived with all his life, lurking just beneath the surface. He had always kept it controlled, but today, it broke free. He turned his back on the scene, the flashing lights from the police cars still reflecting off the cracked sidewalk. Jamal and Tyrell were gone, and no one would be allowed to forget that. The neighborhood around him was buzzing with the aftermath of the shooting. Neighbors were gathering in the streets, their faces still painted with shock. Some of them whispered, some shouted. Phones were buzzing, capturing the chaos, but Martz didn't care. He was focused only on the next step, the next move. His men were already getting the message out. The plan was already in motion. He didn't need to say anything more. But Martz wasn't a man who left anything to chance. His voice would be the one that made sure this city understood the message loud and clear. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out his phone, his fingers tapping against the screen with precision. He made the call. His voice, when it came, was steady. No hesitation, no weakness. $40,000 for every badge, he said, his words cold and deliberate. They echoed over the phone, and in his mind, they echoed over the city, reverberating through every corner, every alley. His men would make sure that everyone heard it, felt it. Dead or alive, the words tasted like steel. He didn't pause. Make it loud, make it count. And with that, the command was set. The bounty was live. The war had begun. As Martz ended the call, he looked up at the skyline. The city stretched out before him like a playground. But now it was a battlefield. The Iron Set was rising, and no one would be able to stop them. The power had shifted. The cops, the city, the people who once held the reins, they were powerless now. But it wasn't about the power. Not anymore. Martz had a purpose now. Revenge. Simple, pure. Unforgiving revenge. Martz didn't walk fast, but the weight of his grief moved him forward like an invisible hand on his back, pushing him. It was the grief of a father who had lost everything. Two sons who had never asked for this life, never chose it, but had been born into it. Jamal and Tyrell had been his hope, his future. They were the next generation, the ones who would carry on his legacy. But now they were gone. And nothing, no amount of revenge, would bring them back. The pain gripped him like a vice, but Martz was too familiar with it to allow it to consume him. This wasn't the time to break down. Grief was for the weak, for those who still had something left to lose. He had nothing left. Nothing but the iron grip of vengeance, tightening with each step he took. As he walked past the corner store, the scent of stale cigarettes mixed with the heavy smell of fear in the air. People peeked out from behind windows, their eyes filled with both sympathy and fear. The gangs controlled this part of the city, but now Martz was setting the rules. His sons' deaths weren't just personal losses. They were the opening salvo in a war Martz would fight with the same ruthlessness that had built his empire. The weight of the envelope in his jacket pocket was a constant reminder. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about control. Power. The city had been his, and now it would be his again. But this time it would be taken by blood, not by negotiations or power plays. This time it would be loud enough for everyone to hear, loud enough for every cop, every criminal, and every citizen to feel by sunrise. The city was already feeling the ripple effect. The word was out. Martz's bounty was live. And it was. Already spreading like wildfire. The news of his $40,000 reward for each police officer's badge echoed through the streets, over the phone lines, and into the darkest corners of the city. The neighborhood was buzzing with whispers and rumors. Those who didn't know the details heard the whispers. $40,000 for every badge, dead or alive. And it didn't take long for the city's underbelly to respond. By the time the morning sun filtered through the buildings, killers from across the country were already on their way. From Memphis, from Detroit, from New Orleans, and other places that carried their own brand of violence. These men, with their cold eyes and quicker hands, were coming to claim what had been promised as they arrived in the city. They moved quickly, seamlessly blending into the chaos that was already brewing. They didn't need to ask questions. They knew what they were here for. The bounty had been set. The cops were now targets. Every street corner, every alleyway was a potential battleground. But Martz's men were already in place, ready to make sure the bounty would be claimed and the blood would flow. The Iron Set had always been known for its precision, its control. And now, Martz had set the stage for something bigger. Killers and bounty hunters had their instructions. They weren't here to collect trophies. They were here to make a statement. Martz's message had to be loud. And that meant hitting hard, hitting fast. The city's police force scrambled to react. They knew the Iron Set wouldn't sit back. They knew they were about to become targets, their badges worth more dead than alive. They made their plans, but it was too late. Martz had already thought ahead. He always did. By the time the first bounty hunter pulled into town, the streets had already started to feel different. Tension crackled in the air. The silence that followed the gunshots the day before now felt like a prelude to something even worse. In the darkest corners of the city, inside empty warehouses and abandoned buildings, Martz's plan began to unfold. Every warehouse, every drop point, every safe house was stocked with weapons, ammunition, and cash. The killers would be well equipped. The streets would belong to Martz, and no one could stop him. Outside, in the sprawling cityscape, his lieutenants were working the phones, sending messages to the right people. They were all coming, all of them. The hitmen, the bounty hunters, the killers eager for a payday. And they weren't here to negotiate. They were here to collect. The bounty was more than just money. It was a signal. A declaration of war. Martz had made it clear. If you wear a badge in this city, you are no longer safe. And he would make sure everyone knew it. The city had begun to transform. Where there had once been routine and normalcy, there was now a creeping tension, growing, ever stronger. Cars moved with purpose, but they weren't filled with families or workers anymore. They were filled with killers, ready to take out anyone who stood in their way. Phones were buzzing constantly, connecting people across neighborhoods, across states. The hunt was on. The streets that had once been quiet in the early morning hours were now alive with movement. Men in black suits, boots and jackets stepping off buses, checking into motels, or slipping through side streets, all heading to the same destination. The bounty hunters had arrived. And as the city prepared for war, Martz stayed calm, cool, and controlled. He watched from a distance, his eyes scanning the skyline. The first shots would be fired soon, but they would not be his. His hands would remain clean for now. His men were the ones on the front lines. But Martz was always in control. This wasn't just a fight for revenge. This was about dominance. He had already won the battle for the streets. Now it was time to take the city. And with the bounty on every cop's head, Martz knew the game had changed forever. By noon, the city had already transformed. The streets were alive, but not with the usual hum of everyday life. Now they pulsed with an electricity that crackled in the air, a palpable tension that sat heavy in the bones of every resident. The morning had been quiet, almost still, but by midday the violence was upon them. Hitmen appeared on corners like shadows, slipping into the city unnoticed, blending into the underworld Martz had carefully cultivated. They were methodical, calculating, their eyes cold with purpose. They moved like predators, blending seamlessly into the crowd, waiting for the right moment to strike. Their presence was a subtle sign of the war that had begun. They were everywhere, leaning against buildings, lurking in alleyways, their hands hidden beneath their coats, ready for whatever came next. And then, the first shots rang out. It was sudden, sharp, and loud, shattering the tense quiet that had filled the morning. The gunfire erupted from a narrow alleyway, cutting through the air like a whip crack. A few seconds later, the unmistakable sound of a patrol car, screeching to a halt, echoed across the block. The officers inside were too slow, too late. Another round of gunfire rang out, louder this time, as the hitmen retreated into the shadows, melting into the maze of side streets. The city's pulse quickened. Residents rushed to their windows, peering out from behind closed blinds, their faces pale with fear and confusion. Phones lit up across the block, capturing the violence unfolding in real time. Everyone was watching, waiting for the next move. The hitmen weren't here for show. They had a purpose, and that purpose was chaos. From that moment on, no one was safe. The gunfire echoed across the city, reverberating through neighborhoods, bouncing off the walls of buildings, cutting through the air like a scream that wouldn't end. There were no warnings, no promises of safety. There was only the sudden, terrifying knowledge that the streets had become a battlefield. The police response came quickly, but they were already stretched thin. Every squad car in the city was on high alert, racing to the scene of the latest gunfire, but it was too little, too late. The officers who responded were outnumbered, overwhelmed. Martz's forces were too well organized, too precise. They moved through the city like a ghost army, slipping between shadows, attacking from every direction. The cops were trying to put out a fire, but the flames were everywhere. The streets, once familiar and comforting, now felt like a war zone. Police barricades were thrown up at key intersections, but it was clear they were powerless to stop the violence. The sirens screamed through the streets, their wail a constant backdrop to the chaos that was unfolding. But the law had lost its hold on the city. It was divided, fractured between the defenders of the streets, Martz's loyalists, and those who still backed the badge, the cops. There were whispers and open arguments on every corner. Some whispered that the cops deserved it, that they had brought this upon themselves with their corruption, their brutality. They had failed to protect the people for years, and now the reckoning had come. Others stood firm, insisting that the cops were the only thing keeping the city from falling apart entirely. They feared the rise of the Iron Set, the chaos that Martz had set in motion. The divide was stark, and the tension was growing by the minute. The public's opinion shifted. People had always feared the gangsters, but now, with Martz's vengeance exacted in full force, there was a dark admiration for his power. Martz had taken the badge off the backs of the cops, and now it was just a piece of metal waiting to be claimed. The Iron Set was no longer just a crew. It was an army, and its leader, Martz, had just declared war. Martz's plan was unfolding exactly as he had envisioned. He had known it would be messy. Chaos was his ally, and in a city ruled by fear, his soldiers thrived. He didn't need to be in the front lines, fighting in the streets. No, his power lay in the shadows. His control was absolute. His eyes were everywhere. His men were organized. They moved with precision. No one was left to chance. His influence spread like a dark cloud across the city, creeping into every corner, every alleyway, and every safe house. The streets were his battleground. The war had begun, and Martz had set the rules. Each move, each step was calculated. Martz didn't leave anything to chance. His men were well trained, prepared for what was to come. They knew what they were fighting for, and they knew exactly who their enemies were. The city had once been a place of opportunity, a place where anyone could rise. But that dream had been shattered long ago, and Martz had built his empire on. The broken backs of the forgotten. The police had tried to stop him, to contain him. They had failed. The more they tried to impose their order, the more Martz's men slipped through the cracks. Each time they caught one of his soldiers, another replaced him within hours. The city had become a breeding ground for chaos, and the police had no way of stopping it. Martz's influence was everywhere. In the shadows, his men moved with purpose. They were everywhere, on corners, in bars, in the basements of old buildings. They wore the badge of loyalty, and that was the only currency that mattered. Every move they made sent a message. Martz controlled the streets. The police were outmatched, and the city was on the brink of a lapse. As Martz watched his plan unfold from his secluded office, a grim satisfaction settled over him. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about something much bigger. This was about power. He had always known the streets were his, but now, more than ever, it was clear. He owned them. His men had infiltrated every corner of the city, making sure no area was untouched. From the south side to the north end, the Iron Set's influence was overwhelming. Police were powerless. They tried to respond, but their squads were outnumbered. Their resources spread too thin. Even their top officers couldn't make a dent in the organization Martz had built. By now, the police had realized they were fighting a losing battle. The neighborhood had already split into two factions. Those who lived in fear of Martz and his crew, and those who felt the police had failed them long ago. The city was divided, and Martz was the one holding the key. He had made it clear from the beginning. This wasn't about just killing cops. It was about sending a message. And the message was simple. No one was safe anymore. Not the police, not the people. And certainly not those who thought they could control the streets without Martz's blessing. In the coming days, the chaos only grew. The violence spread like wildfire, unpredictable and fierce. Each gunfight, each ambush was a small victory for Martz. The police were always one step behind. They moved in larger and larger numbers, but it didn't matter. Martz's men were prepared. From the early morning hours until the dead of night, the war raged. It wasn't just a battle of guns and bullets. It was a battle of control. And Martz was winning. In the darkest corners of the city, the Iron Set continued to expand. Their power was no longer just a rumor. It was a force. The streets, once the domain of cops and law-abiding citizens, now belonged to Martz. No one could stop him. The police could only watch as the city burned. And Martz? He was just getting started. The city had changed. No one could deny it anymore. What had once been a bustling, if rough around the edges, urban sprawl was now an increasingly divided war zone. And the center of it all was Martz. In the wake of his son's deaths, the streets had become a battleground, and Martz wasn't just fighting for revenge. He was fighting for power, for dominance. The police had begun to falter, their once unshakable authority now rattled. What had started as a quiet, calculated retaliation had now spread far beyond Martz's control. It had become a reckoning, not just for the officers who had killed his sons, but for a system that had always turned a blind eye to the violence in the streets. For every cop killed, the lines between right and wrong blurred more. Was Martz a criminal, or was he a man wronged, driven to the edge by the brutal loss of his family? The media couldn't stop talking about it. The city was split, divided into two factions. Those who supported Martz's actions, believing the police had brought this on themselves, and those who feared the growing power of the Iron Set, now seeping into every crack of the city. For the first time in years, people were questioning their loyalties. Was it the badge they respected? Or was it the man who promised revenge? It wasn't just a question of justice anymore. It was a question of survival. As the days dragged on, the tension became unbearable. The streets had been eerily quiet the day after the bounty was placed, but now the echoes of gunfire could be heard more and more frequently. Martz's forces were closing in. Their presence felt in every neighborhood, in every alley, every street corner. The police, stretched thin, were doing everything they could to push back. They had fortified their positions, brought in tactical units, and started patrolling in pairs. But it wasn't enough. Martz's men were everywhere. They moved in the shadows, slipping into houses, disappearing into buildings, making sure the police could never get a handle on them. No one could control the streets anymore. The final confrontation was inevitable. Every cop in the city knew it. They lined up in full gear, bracing themselves for the worst. It was clear that this wasn't just going to be another raid. It wasn't going to be another show of force. This was war, and they were preparing for a storm they couldn't see coming. There was no strategy left to deploy, no plans to be made. The police were outmatched. Martz had already won the first round. Now, all that remained was for him to finish it. His forces were closing in from every direction. The police were scattered, trying to hold their ground. They had the numbers, but they didn't have the control. The tension was suffocating. The city felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the first move. Officers huddled together. In squad cars, radios buzzing with last-minute orders, trying to maintain some semblance of order, but the chaos was spreading faster than they could contain it. From the rooftops, Martz's men watched with cold eyes, calculating the next move. The police were losing ground, and they knew it. The final showdown was coming. It was a showdown that no one wanted, but no one could avoid. Officers lined up, behind barricades, aiming their rifles at the streets, ready to defend themselves. But the streets were no longer theirs. Martz had taken them, and now he was coming for them. The radio crackled to life with a frantic message. All units hold. Your positions. They're moving in. Get ready. This is it. The air felt thick, like it had been electrified, every officer on edge, every hand gripping their weapon, waiting for the first sign of movement. But nothing could prepare them for what happened. Next, the first shots came from nowhere. They were fast, too fast. The police had no time to react. The gunfire tore through the air like thunder, ricocheting off buildings, shattering windows, and sending officers diving for cover. In the span of seconds, the streets erupted into chaos. The sound of gunshots rang out, mingling with the shrieks of sirens and the panicked cries of civilians. Martz's men were everywhere. A coordinated assault, overwhelming the police forces. At every turn, squad cars were overturned, their flashing lights still spinning, but now rendered useless in the growing storm. Officers scrambled to respond, but it was clear the game had changed. The police were no longer in control. Martz's forces moved with precision, cutting through the city like an unstoppable force. They worked in silence, slipping into the shadows, appearing only when they were ready to strike. They knew the streets. They knew the angles. The police, on the other hand, were fighting blind, unsure of where the next attack would come from. One by one, the officers fell. Some were caught in the open. Others were ambushed in their cars. The city became a shooting gallery, with Martz's men picking off their targets with ease. The officers were outgunned, outmaneuvered, and outnumbered. What had started as a battle between gangsters and cops had now turned into something else entirely. It was a battle for control of the city, and the police were losing. The streets were no longer safe for anyone. Martz had turned the city into his battlefield, and the war was being fought in every alley, every street corner, and every open space. The police were falling back, retreating from their positions, trying to regroup. But Martz's forces were relentless. As the city descended into chaos, Martz stood at the heart of it all, his cold eyes watching as his men pushed forward. He had already won. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about power. And Martz had it all. By the time the smoke cleared, the city was forever altered. It had been changed in ways no one could have predicted. The badge, once a symbol of authority, a symbol of protection, was no longer anything of the sort. It was a target. No longer something to be revered. It had become something to be hunted. The cops who had once held it proudly were now marked men. Martz, untouched, stood among his men, his son's blood avenged. He had done what no one had expected. He had taken control of the streets. He had taken control of the city. The streets were his, but at what cost? The city had been torn apart. What was once a bustling metropolis was now a fractured, divided battlefield. The war wasn't over, but the first chapter had been written. Martz had claimed victory, but the damage was far from done. The cost of his revenge was high. The police were decimated. The public was divided. And the city, once united by law and order, was now a place of fear and uncertainty. The final stand had been a bloodbath. And while Martz stood victorious, there was no joy in his eyes. There was no celebration. There was only the cold satisfaction of a man who had achieved his goal, but at the cost of everything he had once known. The streets were his, but the city would never be the same again. In the aftermath, as the sirens faded and the dust settled, the question remained, was it worth it? Martz had avenged his sons, but at what price? The city was broken, its heart torn out by the violence he had unleashed. And as Martz stood alone, watching his empire unfold before him, he knew that the battle was far from over. This was only the beginning. The war had just started, and the city, now forever changed, would never be the same again. The streets that had once been filled with families, children playing, neighbors talking, and cars moving slowly down the block now lay silent, almost haunted. The sounds of everyday life had been replaced by the steady march of armed men. The city was no longer safe. Law enforcement had been overwhelmed, and the fear that had settled into the air was no longer just felt in the dark corners of the city. It was felt everywhere. From the glossy skyscrapers downtown to the crumbling streets of the South Side, the chaos spread like wildfire. The aftermath was a city in turmoil. The protests had already begun, first small and uncertain, but quickly growing into massive demonstrations that clogged the streets. The people were divided, confused, and angry. Half of them blamed the police for their failures, for allowing the corruption to fester, and for letting Martz's power grow unchecked. The other half feared the rise of the Iron Set, worried that Martz's reign would never end, and that the lawlessness would consume everything. It was as though the city had split in two, torn apart by its own contradictions. Those who had once looked to the police for protection now stood in opposition to them, while those who had always viewed the Iron Set as nothing more than criminals now saw them as defenders, avengers, heroes in their own right. The media coverage was relentless, cameras capturing every moment of the violence, every bit of unrest. News anchors reported the escalating protests, the chaos in the streets, and the police's struggle to maintain control. Headlines screamed about the bounty on the cops' heads, and Martz's name was on the lips of every reporter, every commentator, every citizen. The footage was everywhere. Riot police clashing with protesters, civilians running for cover, squad cars racing to blocked-off streets. But amid it all, one thing was clear. The city was no longer the same. Protesters marched in the streets, their chants echoing through the neighborhoods, demanding justice for the deaths of the teens, for the failed justice system, and for the oppression they had lived under for years. But there was also fear of what Martz would do next, fear of the ever-growing Iron Set, fear that the chaos they had started might be too big to control. And the police? They were scrambling, trying to regain control, but it was too late. The force was stretched thin, their numbers no longer enough to deal with the growing unrest. Officers were out in full riot gear, barricading themselves in and responding with force. But it was clear that they were losing ground. The badge had lost its power. No one trusted the cops anymore. Everyone was on edge, everyone was suspicious, and no one knew who to turn to. The law had fractured, and the cracks were too wide to fill in every corner of the city. Residents were wondering who they could trust. Was Martz's crew the new law of the streets? Was it the police, who had failed so many, or the people, who had risen up to demand change? People huddled in their homes, glued to their screens, waiting to see who would come out on top. Some saw Martz's reign as a necessary evil, while others feared what he had done to the city. By now, everyone knew that the battle for control had shifted. And with each passing day, it became clearer that Martz was here to stay. His legacy was being cemented in the streets, his name now synonymous with both terror and power. Martz sat in his private office, watching the news unfold on the television. His empire stood tall, as solid and unyielding as the walls around him. He had done it. He had avenged his sons. He had taken the streets back. He had given the city a new order, one built on the foundation of fear, revenge, and ruthlessness. Martz had won, but as the images flashed across the screen, protesters demanding justice, police fighting back, the city in flames. There was no joy in his eyes. There was no satisfaction. His sons were dead, and the city that he had once loved was now a broken, fractured shadow of its former self. For all the victory, all the power he had gained, Martz felt nothing but emptiness. His sons, the two people who had mattered most to him in the world, were gone. Revenge had been his purpose, but now that it was fulfilled, it felt hollow. His vengeance had torn the city apart, left it in ruins, and in doing so, it had destroyed everything he once held. Dear Martz had built his empire on blood, and now the city was paying the price. The war he had started would never end. There was no going back. The people, once oppressed, now looked to him as their savior, but Martz knew better. He was not a savior. He was a man of darkness, of revenge, and of cold, calculated power. As the days passed and the protests raged on, Martz couldn't shake the bitter realization that his actions had not just avenged his sons. They had irrevocably shattered the world they had lived in. What had once been a place of hope, of community, was now a city in turmoil, its heart ripped out by the violence he had unleashed. The streets were still under his control, but the cost was high. His victory had come at the expense of the city's soul, and Martz, despite all his power, could not ignore the deep, gnawing emptiness that had settled in his chest. The world had been changed, yes, but for what? For revenge? For power? For a city that no longer existed? Martz had created a new world, a world of fear, of lawlessness, and of war, but in doing so, he had destroyed everything he had once loved. His sons, his city, his humanity. All of it was gone. As the weeks passed, the damage was clear. The protests began to die down, but the division between the people and the police remained. The city was forever fractured. No one trusted anyone anymore. The law had failed. The streets were ruled by Martz's men, and the police were powerless to stop them. What had been a city of law and order was now a city of violence and fear, where every corner held a threat, where every face could be an enemy. Martz had won. But as he looked out over the city that had once been his home, he realized that there would be no peace, no relief. The city would always be in turmoil. The Iron Set would always be at war with the police, and the streets would always be soaked in blood. Martz had created something he could never control. The rage he had felt when his sons were killed had driven him to this point, to take back the streets, to make them his own. But in doing so, he had created a new war, a war that would never end. His sons were gone, but their deaths had birthed something much larger than he had ever anticipated. The legacy of Martz's reign would live on in the blood of the streets, in the fear of the people, and in the brokenness of the city. There would be no winners in this war, only survivors. The city was forever changed, and Martz, standing at the edge of it all, realized that he was no longer the king. He was the architect of its destruction. The cost of revenge had been too high. The battle for control was over, but the war, the endless war, was just beginning.